Hello, I'm Keith R.A. DeCandido, and welcome to a special three-part episode of KRAD COVID readings. Once again, I'm taking one of my longer pieces of fiction and spreading it out over several episodes in the interest of preserving your attention span. Back in 2011, I took my first and so far only foray into the wild and wacky world of thriller fiction. Stephen Savile, a British writer living in Sweden and a buddy of mine since 2008, we were on a Doctor Who panel together at DragonCon. He invited me, as well as Alex Black, Jordan Ellinger, and Jason Fisher, to contribute to a four-part series of interconnected novellas called Viral. The theme of Viral was dealing with various current events at the time we wrote it, so it doesn't have to do with a pandemic, so it's not that kind of viral. But it did involve medicine and terrorism and black ops and other fun stuff. One of the suggestions Stephen had for what to do was a story involving a reporter who broke the story, and I jumped at that one. So they were all published, as I said, in 2011, as first as four separate novellas, then as an omnibus. Unfortunately, it's no longer available 9 years later, at least not under that title. I did reprint it in my short story collection without a license. I'm not sure about Alex, Jordan, or Jason, what they did with theirs, but in any case, you can at least find mine there. And I'm going to read it for you now. It's called, since it's about a journalist, it's called -30-, which is what reporters used to put at the end of their articles to show that they had reached the end of the article. So. Joe Lombardo had been in the middle of the dream when his alarm woke him. He was getting an award. He always remembered that much. Whenever he had the dream, the entire thing was just like when he won the Pulitzer back in 1998 for the series he did on the horrors of Kosovo. But the award he got varied from dream to dream. Sometimes the second Pulitzer that had eluded him in real life, or the Nobel Prize for Literature for one of the books that he'd never actually finished, or a trophy for one of the many fighting tournaments that Kaicho had tried and failed to get him to sign up for, or an Academy Award for the screenplay he'd never gotten around to starting. But every time, no matter what award his dream self had earned, he always got it at the luncheon on the Columbia University campus where they gave out the Pulitzers. He fumbled for his smartphone on the nightstand, but he couldn't locate it, though he did manage to knock his glasses onto the rug. Sweet Christ, don't let me step on them, he thought, as he gingerly set his feet down on the throw rug that protected his bare feet from the cold hardwood. Then he felt around, while the phone kept up its insistent beeping. Finally locating the glasses, he snatched the wireframe spectacles off the floor and put them on. Able to see actual objects instead of fuzzy shapes, he now saw that his phone was dancing across his bureau, thanks to the vibrate function, even as the beeping continued to fill the air. Right. I left it on the bureau so I wouldn't just snooze it and fall back asleep. He stumbled toward the bureau and switched off the alarm. Why the fuck did I set the damn thing for 8? As if on cue, Kane came loping into the bedroom on all fours, looked up at him with his big eyes, and mewed. Right, he said down to the cat. It's your fault, stupid diabetes. He reached down to the floor and picked the 15-pound tortoiseshell up. Kane rubbed his head into Joe's neck, and Joe absently scratched behind the cat's ears as he wandered out of the bedroom, navigating carefully through the minefield of dirty laundry, half-read books, and DVD and CD cases that were strewn about. One of these days, he was going to clean the place. Right after I finish the book and start the screenplay. He wandered down the hall of his one-bedroom apartment to the kitchen, where the insulin was stored in the refrigerator. After filling one of the syringes with 4 units and sticking Kane in the back with it, he dug out the special food that the cat, as a diabetic, had to eat now, and dumped 2 scoops of it into his bowl. Kane's reward for allowing a human to shove a needle into his back. After checking the fountain to make sure there was enough water for the cat, he got the coffee maker going, and then stumbled back into the bedroom, his brain having finally acknowledged what he saw on the phone when he turned the alarm off. He had voicemail and 3 missed calls. He checked the latter first. Edward Jackson, his editor at the New York Daily News, the trunk line for the MTA, and a 347 number he didn't recognize. Putting the phone to his ear, he ambled back to the kitchen and played the voicemail. There was, conveniently, one for each missed call. He played the first one just as the coffee maker started making the B-movie monster sounds, indicating that it was working properly. Lombardo, it's Eddie. There's going to be a presser at City Hall at noon announcing the new snow emergency plan for mass transit. You will be there. Call me when you wake your lazy ass up. Like I wouldn't be there? He said to the kitchen as the phone went to the next one. That would be someone at the MTA, and the first message now made the second one's source more understandable. Yo, Joe, it's Afio over at Transit. Listen, I got something for you. Hit me back on my cell. Joe sighed. Afio was a convenient source in the MTA who wishes to remain anonymous, but he wasn't going to stay that way if he kept calling reporters from his office phone. Then came the mystery number. Joseph, this is Nick Rogova. I don't know if you remember me, but I am in New York, and I thought perhaps we should meet. I know it has been a few years, yes? But I've got something for you. I'll be at the Dunkin' Donuts on Broadway and 96th all afternoon. Do not call this number back. Sweet Christ, Joe muttered, staring at the phone for a second and then replaying the message to make sure he wasn't going completely crazy. No, that's definitely Nick's voice. He always met it at Dunkin', but why the fuck is he calling me from a local number? Besnik Rogova was a CIA analyst who had been a useful deep background source back in the day. In a lot of ways, Nick was responsible for Joe's Pulitzer. An Albanian-American who wrote reports for the CIA on his family's homeland and its environs, he had been more than willing to help a reporter bring the atrocities committed against Albanians to light. But he hadn't heard from Nick in at least 5 years. On a whim, he called the number Nick called from. 3 beeps, then, the number you have reached is no longer in service. Joe frowned as he pulled a mug that had the dictionary definition of coffee written on it down from the cabinet and poured the freshly brewed beverage into it. Nick had never been the type to use disposable cell phones, yet he had apparently come to New York and purchased a burner for the express purpose of leaving a message with Joe. Sipping the hot black coffee, he wondered what it was all about. He had the press conference at noon over at the hall, then he'd need to schlep all the way up to 96 on the 2 or 3 train to meet with Nick. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been back up that way. Since moving to the Lower East Side, he'd rarely ventured north of Houston Street, much less up to the old neighborhood. But he could worry about that later. He called his boss back next. Jackson. Hey there, Ed. It's Joe. Don't fucking call me that, Eddie said automatically. Joe was one of the few in the city room who still used that nickname, as the others had all been frightened into dropping it. But the others were all younger and hadn't worked in a war zone, so they were easier to intimidate. You get my message? No, I just like hearing the dulcet tones of your voice first thing in the AM. Yeah, I got it. Also got a call from my guy at the MTA, so there may be a wrinkle. What'd he say? Joe blinked. I haven't called him back yet. Motherfucker. What I always tell you, Lombardo, call your source before you call your editor. The source may not wait. I don't want to have that conversation until the coffee kicks in. Eddie made a weird kind of noise that sounded like a radiator letting out steam. You called me before coffee? Shrugging, Joe said, I don't need to be coherent to talk to you. I don't need to remember what you say, because I never listen to you anyhow. Well, that shit's certainly true. Hold on. Eddie then distantly yelled at someone in the bullpen, having moved the phone far enough from his mouth to make the words indistinct. Then he came back. All right, listen. I need something for the website soon as the thing's over, all right? Joe winced. He hated cobbling together pieces that fast. Eddie wouldn't let him complain. Yeah, I know. You need time to mull over your words and pick the right semicolon and all that other shit. But we need hits on the damn site, so will you shut the fuck up about how computers kill journalism? I never said that. I said the web killed journalism. And write the damn piece, Eddie continued as if Joe hadn't spoken. You can do your froofy op-ed shit for the morning, but I need the news in there right off. So why not send a reporter to do that because your ass is the only one I'm sending? Mia's still covering the Bronx DA race, Freddie's on vacation, Juan's tracking down. All right. He sighed. Remember when newspapers had, a budget? No. Eddie made the radiator noise again. Go call your MTA guy. And that was my cat, Kaylee, saying hi. There was a time when Joe wouldn't have taken his laptop onto the subway. It was like wearing a sign saying, please steal this expensive piece of equipment. But one day, a year earlier, he looked around and realized that there were at least a dozen people in the subway car who were holding a piece of electronic equipment that was both smaller and worth more than his battered old laptop. So as he sat on a 3 train that rumbled upward from Chambers Street, he opened up his netbook and started turning the notes he'd taken during the press conference, as well as those he'd taken when he'd called Afio back, into something resembling a news piece suitable for the hallowed pixels of nydailynews.com. He kept at it until the train decelerated into the 96th Street station. Cursing that he hadn't finished the piece, he actually sat with the laptop on one of the 96th Street benches and typed until he got to the end of the article. Not bothering to proof it or even spell check it, that was his editor's job, and if there were infelicities in the writing, well, that was all the people who insisted on reading newspapers on computers deserved. He saved it and closed the laptop. Once he got above ground, he'd be able to catch a wireless signal and email the article to Eddie. The cold winter air sliced through him as soon as he stepped onto the 96th Street platform, and it only got worse when he jogged up the stairs and went outside, the November wind whipping viciously down Broadway. Should have worn gloves. Wandering into the donut shop, Joe looked around to see a bald man with a hawk nose reading a copy of the New York Times. He looked up at Joe's entrance and then smiled, showing teeth that had been yellowed from years of cigarette smoking. Joe held up a finger and then went to the counter, ordering a large black coffee and a chocolate frosted donut. After receiving and paying for the order, only then did he join Nick, clutching the coffee in the hopes that it would restore feeling to his hands. "What happened to your hair?" he asked with a grin. Pointing at Joe's belly, Nick said, "It transformed into fat and moved from my head to your stomach, yes?" Joe chuckled. "Yeah, well, things have slowed down a bit." Nick had meticulously folded and set down the paper while Joe ordered, and now he put a hand on it. "I couldn't find your byline in today's paper, Joseph." "Firstly, it's Joe. I know I went by Joseph when we first met, but I was young and pretentious. And now I'm older and crankier. Joe suits me better. Secondly, I haven't been with the Times in a few years. They wouldn't let me leave the foreign desk. I'm at the Daily News now." His expression getting sour, Nick said, "Truly?" Yeah, Joe said with a dismissive wave. "I know, it's not the Times, but at least I don't have to use honorifics all the fucking time." "True, but you must also spell kidnapped with only one P, yes?" Joe laughed and then took a sip of his coffee. "It certainly explains the change from Joseph to Joe. So you're no longer a foreign correspondent?" No. Had more than enough of being shot at, thanks. Now I cover local politics. Usually I only have to travel to City Hall, which is all of a mile from my apartment. It's calmer and more conducive to surviving to retire and bounce my grandchildren on my knee." Nick's eyebrows raised. "You have grandchildren?" Joe winced. "Well, I have to have kids first." "You and Alyssa are..." Knowing he was going to say something like trying, Joe cut him off. "Divorced for 3 years now." It was Nick's turn to wince. "I'm sorry." He let out a long breath. "It may be that you're not the right person to give this to, yes? But I do not know any other reporters well enough to trust them." "Well, why don't you tell me what it is, and I can tell you who had the news to pass it on to." "No." Nick shook his head sadly, staring down at the battered Formica table. "It must be you, Joseph." He allowed himself a small smile and corrected himself. "Joe, rather. I know you'll do right by this information and use it to help people rather than sensationalize. It's why I was willing to keep being your source after Kosovo. You proved with that story that you would do the right thing given a choice, yes?" Joe sipped his coffee to cover up a derisive snicker. The only thing he was after was the Pulitzer that he got. While it was all well and good that people were helped, that had never been the objective. At best, it was a fortuitous side effect. Of course, Joseph Lombardo would have agreed wholeheartedly with Nick. He was an idealistic little twerp. A year in Kosovo, 2 years in Afghanistan, and another year in Iraq pretty much cured him of that. Not that he was going to tell Nick any of this. No sense letting the poor bastard do anything to think well of me. "One of the methods by which the agency is performing some of its covert operations is to piggyback onto existing vaccination and immunization programs, yes? Operatives will pose as doctors or nurses with Doctors Without Borders or some such, or perhaps they co-opt someone local. They give inoculations, but it is a means to an end." Frowning, Joe asked, "How's helping people aid an op?" "In Pakistan, they were mishandling the needles so that some blood comes out onto the syringe. Then they do a DNA test to see if it matches the profile of a terrorist brother who was already captured. And that's just one example." First, Joe sipped his coffee, trying to properly compose his next words. "I'm not sure what the problem is. I mean, people are still getting immunizations, right?" "Some are. But the inoculations are not always complete or properly administered, making them less than useless. Plus, there's a great deal of propaganda and paranoia against these inoculations in the first place, yes? Something like this just makes it worse. The World Health Organization constantly tries to convince people that vaccinations are safe and helpful, and things like this just undermine it." Visions of another Pulitzer luncheon dancing in his head, Joe tried not to sound over-enthusiastic. "Isn't it risky, you giving this to me?" Nick gave another small smile. "I have not yet actually given it to you, yes? I was not aware that you weren't on this beat anymore." Yeah, that was the biggest problem. Joe had only even met the News foreign editors a couple of times and wasn't even sure he knew their names. They probably knew of his history with the Times, those several years and many sets of layoffs ago, so they may not have. Did they even take a story from me? You could always go back to the Times with it. It wasn't entirely ethical since they were a direct competitor of his current employer, and it might cost him his job. But this was huge. Potential. What exactly do you have? Interdepartmental memos, authorizations, a few photos, one or two field reports. It's all on an encrypted jump drive, which is back in my hotel room, yes? I can give you the drive and the decryption software. It took all of Joe's self-control not to do a spit take with his coffee. This wasn't just a source with a rumor he heard around the water cooler. Nick was talking about giving him the motherload. If everything worked out right, Joe could write his own ticket. With the number of ways it could go wrong, were legion. Won't this jeopardize your career? Joe asked, legitimately concerned. True, he hadn't spoken to Nick in years, but he still considered the older man to be a friend, or at least a treasured acquaintance. That got a bitter chuckle out of Nick. What career? I've been marginalized. I began my career in the CIA under President Reagan. Everyone thinks me a relic, that my ideas are too 20th century. I write reports on Canada, yes? There is no duty less useful to the Central Intelligence Agency than my reports on Canada. Nick leaned forward. I no longer have a career. And if this is what the CIA believes to be a viable strategy, then I no longer wish to have a career. Alarm bells started pinging in Joe's head. How much of this is a legitimate problem and how much is Nick's midlife crisis? Sweet Christ, how much of it is my midlife crisis? Nick put a hand on Joe's shoulder. But this is something that can make your career. Yeah. Joe took a deep breath. Nick removed the hand and regarded him intently. Finally, Joe said, Look, Nick, I need to think about this, okay? Of course, Joseph. Joe, I understand. After slugging down the rest of his coffee, he added, Plus, I've got an op-ed to write about the MTA's new snow emergency plan. Joe then remembered that he never actually cracked open his laptop in order to email the news piece for the website. Hell with it. Can we meet tomorrow morning? I cannot wait that long, Joe. I must have a response tonight, yes? Of course, you don't steal a smorgasbord of confidential CIA material and sit on it for days on end. Fine. Why don't we meet at midnight? I know a place, but no. We shall meet at my hotel. Nick then gave Joe the name and address of the no-tell motel he was staying at a dump down in Chelsea that charged by the hour. Joe frowned as he put the name and address in his phone. If you're staying down there, why'd we meet all the way uptown? I had remembered that you and your wife lived on West End Avenue, yes? That got a sigh out of Joe. Yeah, we lived up on 102nd. He shook his head. That was a long time ago. He rose to his feet and held out a hand. Whatever I decide, Nick, it's been great seeing you again. Wish I could say the same, Joe. Excuse me? Joe thought that to be a bit insulting. I would have preferred to see you under good circumstances. Oh, right. Joe nodded, then shook his head, then headed out the door. The weight of this decision heavy on his mind. Normally, Joe would write a 500-word op-ed piece on the mendacity of the mayor and the incompetence of the Mass Transit Authority in an hour or two, especially given that he'd done a draft of the thing on the subway earlier that day. But as he sat in the small dining room of his apartment, he kept allowing himself to be distracted by the view of the Williamsburg Bridge out the window. Never mind that he'd been seeing that view for the past 3 years, to the point where he had every damn strut of the span memorized. He'd been futzing around with the op-ed piece for 4 hours, and now it was creeping toward 11, and had only squeezed 200 words out, pausing only to give Kane his shot and feed him at 8. What is wrong with me? Of course he knew the answer. Nick's story kept crowding the MTA one out of his brain. He was also feeling woozy, which made him realize that while he'd remembered to feed his cat, he hadn't done likewise for himself. Grabbing his smartphone, he called the pizza place across the street. Hey Val, it's Joe. Yeah, the usual small. Thanks. He ended the call, grateful for having regular eating habits with a place that was open until 2 in the morning, and then saw a dialogue box pop up in the lower right-hand corner of his screen, telling him that Alyssa Albanese was online on Skype. Yes! It was 7 a.m. in Baghdad, so his ex-wife would just be getting up. He alt-tabbed over to Skype and clicked on her name. Can you do a video chat, he typed? I need to talk to you about something. After an eternity, she finally replied, and good morning to you too. Give me a minute to freshen up. Seriously? I've seen you naked. Worse, I've seen you first thing in the AM. Not sure which is more frightening. Hardy har har. Then he got the request for the video chat, and Joe let out a long breath, accepting the request. A moment later, a slightly pixelated version of Alyssa's face appeared, taking up most of the screen. His own image appeared in the lower right-hand corner, which he minimized. It always freaked him out to see himself on his own webcam. Alyssa was obviously fresh out of the shower, as her brown hair was stringy and wet, and she wore a well-battered bathrobe. Sweet Christ, didn't I give you that robe as a wedding present? Her voice came out of the laptop's tinny speakers. Joe, I've got to get dressed and get to the clinic. What do you want? Don't let me stop you. I haven't seen a naked woman in ages. Please. I've seen your web browser history, and that was when we were married. Or did you mean you haven't been naked with a woman with the tits you haven't seen a woman naked with the tits she was born with? Joe swallowed. No, that's just me. I'd say I'm sorry and I couldn't resist, but I'm not sorry and I could have easily resisted. I just chose not to. Defensively, Joe said, I haven't been to those sites in weeks. That was mostly true. Alyssa brushed a lock of wet hair out of her face. Much as I'm enjoying this reliving of the final year of our marriage. Right. Joe took a breath. You guys do vaccinations, right? Yeah, when we can. Alyssa worked with Médecins Sans Frontières, currently assigned to Iraq. It's hard because a lot of the people are taught that vaccinations are evil and that they don't work and all the other bullshit. Of course, those same people want to know why we can't keep their kids from getting polio. It's a vicious circle. Joe nodded, hoping he sounded at least vaguely sincere. How would you feel if, say, the CIA used an inoculation program to find a terrorist? I would try desperately to summon up the energy to be surprised and probably fail. If I wasn't so exhausted all the time, I'd even get outraged. Why? Joe hesitated just long enough for Alyssa to see where he was going. Oh, hell no. Joe, do you know? He held up a hand. I don't know anything. I've got a possible source that might have something. You need to find out, Joe. Seriously, I am not fucking around. You have to find out. And if you do find out, you have to stop it from happening. Joe shook his head. I can't really do that. I mean, I can report it, but oh God, Joe, no. That'd be a disaster. Didn't you hear what I just said? Which part? Alyssa actually got up and started pacing. If word gets out that the vaccinations are CIA plots, we'll never get to inoculate anyone. She started pacing away from her laptop. Alyssa? Realizing what she'd done, she sat back down in front. Joe tried not to notice that the bathrobe had fallen open a little bit. Joe, listen to me very carefully. If you report this, millions of kids will die because their parents won't take them to a clinic. It'll justify every single dumb shit conspiracy theory out there. Sure, they may capture one terrorist, but they make it easier for the next 100 terrorists and for their recruiters, who'll go on about the great deceivers of the West. She pointed at the camera to accentuate her words. You have to get them to stop it. Joe leaned back. How am I supposed to do that? How the hell should I know? I couldn't even get you to clean the toilet. Artie har har, Joe muttered, throwing her favorite retort back at her. Look, I need to get back to an op-ed piece. I'll let you know what happens, okay? You'd better. She glowered at him through the computer screen, and the connection hiccuped, so her face was frozen there for several seconds. This is some bad shit, Joe. Yeah. He hesitated, then asked the question he'd been wanting to ask her for years. Alyssa, I came back from Iraq for you. So I gotta ask, why'd you go there? She just stared at the camera for a couple of seconds. Then Joe realized it was frozen again. Goodbye, Joe, she finally said, and ended the connection. Joe tried to retype the question in the chat window, but Alyssa went offline while he was in the midst of typing. He decided to go ahead and send it. She'd see it when next she came online. He stared at the same paragraph of the op-ed piece for the next 10 minutes, changing that to which and back again 4 times, before the buzzer rang with his desperately needed pizza. It took him from the time he paid for the pizza to his finishing of the second slice to make his decision. Saving and abandoning the op-ed piece, Joe placed the pizza box in the oven. It didn't fit in the fridge, and he needed to keep Kane out of it somehow, and grabbed his leather coat. There were no cabs to be found, so he hopped on the F train, which was only a few blocks away. The entire time he jumped up and down to keep warm while waiting for an F to finally show up. He wondered if he was doing the right thing. He also wondered what exactly he was doing. Was he meeting a source for a story? Or was he going to do, well, whatever it is Alyssa thought he should do? Scold Nick? Tell him to go back to the CIA and stop it? Right, if he could do that, he wouldn't come to me for the first time in ages. He said he'd been marginalized, which meant I was his last resort, not his first one. In retrospect, Joe realized he probably should have said some of that to Alyssa. The F finally clattered into the station. The heat was a massive relief, and he took off his gloves and unbuttoned his coat. He had no trouble finding a seat. While there were plenty of people coming in from Brooklyn, East Broadway was the first Manhattan stop on the northbound F, there were still seats available. By the time the train pulled into 23rd Street, he knew what he had to do. It took him another 10 minutes to walk across from 6th to 8th Avenue, where Nick's crummy hotel was. The place was one of those Manhattan buildings from 100 years ago that was probably really nice when it was built. What Joe didn't know about architecture was a lot, to paraphrase one of his favorite movie quotes, so he had no idea what all those fancy designs on the facade were all about. But he did know that they probably weren't supposed to be cracked and broken. He pushed open the dirty glass door that looked like it belonged to a 1970s high school, and was confronted by a lobby that had last been painted during the Carter administration. Cheap, split linoleum squeaked under his sneakers, and cracked leather sofas sat against the south and east walls. The west wall had what once was a grand staircase, with an elevator right next to it. Next to the door on the north wall was an alcove protected by bulletproof glass, behind which sat a young man of Indian descent, reading what looked like a medical textbook. The clerk barely looked up from his studies to acknowledge Joe, who went straight to the elevator. He noticed a security camera as he waited for the elevator. A closer look revealed that it wasn't actually hooked into anything, and its indicator light was dark. Joe recognized the make and model. It wasn't battery-powered. It was cosmetic security, enough to make the clients feel safe, but not actually requiring the expense of maintaining video surveillance. The elevator clanked down to the lobby, and the door rumbled aside. Joe stepped in and pushed the round plastic button for the 6th floor. You really didn't spare any expense on accommodations, did you, Nick? After a sudden lurch that almost brought Joe's pizza back into his throat, he was carried up 6 flights. He practically leapt out of the door as soon as it slid open, resolving to take the stairs back down. When he arrived at the end of the hall, he knocked on 6C. He knew it was 6C because of the impression from the number of the letter still left on the wooden door. The 6C itself, probably tarnished brass based on the residue and what he'd seen on other doors, was long gone. The door creaked open from the impact of his fist knocking on it. Nice lock, Nick, he said with a chuckle. Seriously, there's a Comfort Inn just a few blocks from here. Couldn't you have... Joe cut himself off as he realized that Nick wasn't going to be replying to him. His erstwhile informant lay on a thin stretch of ugly carpet between the hotel's room's bed and bureau. Nick's eyes stared lifelessly upward, right hand on the foot of the bed, legs splayed as if he fell. The room was small and cramped, but the lighting was poor enough that you couldn't see what a dump it was, or at least could avoid thinking about it. The bed had a hideously patterned bedspread. The wall over the bed had the single ugliest painting Joe had ever seen, and this after covering modern art openings when he first broke into journalism. The carpet was a really unfortunate shade of brown, and the TV on the bureau looked like it was purchased brand new in 1987. His years covering wars on foreign soil had provided him with ample opportunities to look at dead bodies, and he had quickly learned that the main difference between the living and the deceased was that the latter didn't move at all. Living people moved in so many subtle ways, but the dead were utterly motionless. Nick's body was utterly motionless. Unbidden, his mind went back to his first day in Kosovo. American soldiers had found a house that was filled with corpses. 17 people, members of 2 families, all Albanian, all slaughtered. They'd been dead a while, their flesh and decaying organs giving off a horrid stench. He hadn't just smelled it, he tasted it. With him had been a reporter from the London Times, Clive or Colin or something like that. He was in his 60s and he just smiled, showing teeth that were even yellower than Nick's had been at Duncan's, and elbowed Joe in the side. Could be worse, mate, he said. Could be you over there. Joe shuddered at the memory. Biting his lip, he stared more closely at Nick's body on the hotel room floor. There were no visible signs of trauma, no petechial hemorrhaging, no bruises, no obvious bleeding, no discoloration except for those smoker's teeth. Then he did the only thing he could do. He called 911. A CIA analyst was dead in a cheap motel in Manhattan. There was no way the agency was going to let the local cops handle this for long. But Joe wanted to make sure that they were there and started their own paperwork so there was at least a chance that Nick would get a proper death investigation by a detective who might possibly give a shit about something other than politics. His years of covering Washington had convinced him that federal agents were useless when it came to actually solving crimes. Besides, he had no faith that this wouldn't be covered up by the agency. Getting NYPD here might at least forestall that. Joe went back to the lobby via the staircase, which only creaked some from his weight, and walked up to the medical student behind the scratched bulletproof glass. Without even looking up from his textbook, the young man said, "May I help you?" "You should know that the police are going to be here shortly. There's a dead body in 6C. That got his attention. "I'm sorry?" "The occupant of 6C is dead. I called the police." "Why would you do that?" The young man was panicking. This is terrible! Joe just stared at the clerk. I have curiosity. What's the alternative to calling the police? Well, calling the owner. He will know what to do. The clerk snatched the phone off the hook and punched in several numbers. He's going to kill me. No problem. The police will be here already to investigate your murder, too. The clerk just gave him a nasty look at that. To be continued on Wednesday. Thank you very much for watching. Please stay tuned on Wednesday for part 2. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And please check me out online. DeCandido.net is my website. DeCandido.wordpress.com is my blog. And Patreon.com/KRAD is my Patreon. Please support it if you can. Thanks very much. Please stay safe.